A billionaire brought 5 of the most powerful women in the city to meet his daughter. Perfect smiles, perfect names, perfect futures. But when his daughter finally made her choice, she didn't pick any of them. She reached for the hand of the woman who cleaned his floors every morning before the sun came up. Some people walk into a room already glowing, dressed in gold, speaking in confidence, and they leave behind nothing but the memory of their perfume. And then there are people who walk in quietly, holding a broom instead of a purse, and somehow, without even trying, they leave a mark on your heart that money could never buy. This is the story of one billionaire, his daughter, and the woman who changed everything, without ever asking for anything in return. If you love stories about real worth, quiet strength, and people who win not because of what they own, but because of who they are, follow this channel now because this story is going to stay with you long after it ends. Franklin Hayes did not build his fortune by being kind. He built it by being relentless. Every deal he closed, every company he bought, every risk he took, it all came from one belief. Only the strong survive and everyone else just watches. He owned buildings in 6 cities. His name was on hospital wings and university libraries. When he walked into a room, conversations paused. When he made a call, people answered before the second ring. But underneath all that power, there was one place in Franklin's life where control meant nothing, and her name was Eleanor. Eleanor was 26 years old and she was nothing like her father, at least not on the surface. Where Franklin calculated, Eleanor felt. Where Franklin gave orders, Eleanor asked questions. She had grown up inside marble hallways and manicured gardens, surrounded by staff, drivers, and tutors. But even with everything money could buy, she always sensed something missing. Not comfort, not luxury, something real. Franklin had been alone for almost 10 years. Eleanor's mother had passed away when Eleanor was just 17, and since that day something inside Franklin had quietly shut its doors. He buried himself deeper into work, deeper into control, deeper into the idea that if he managed everything perfectly, nothing could ever hurt him again. And part of that management in his mind was Eleanor's future. So one evening, over dinner in a dining room large enough to host a wedding, Franklin told Eleanor his plan. He had chosen 5 women, accomplished, connected from respected families. He wanted Eleanor to spend time with them. Not for marriage, he was quick to explain, just to build the right circle, just to surround herself with people who could open doors instead of closing them. Eleanor looked at her father over her glass of water and said nothing for a long moment. Then she smiled the way she always did when she disagreed but chose not to argue and said, "Okay, Dad, I'll meet them." Franklin took that as a win. He had no idea it would become the beginning of something he never expected at all. The 5 women arrived over the next several days, each one more polished than the last. The first was Isabella Cross. She stepped out of a private car in a coat that cost more than most people's rent. Her beauty looked designed, every strand of hair in place. She shook Eleanor's hand while scanning her outfit at the same time, the way people do when they are complimenting you and judging you in one motion. She talked about her family's real estate empire, her homes in 3 countries, her connections in fashion and finance. When a young staff member accidentally bumped her bag while setting the table, Isabella didn't yell. She didn't need to, her look said everything. Eleanor noticed. Eleanor always noticed. The second was Monique Reyes, sharp, quick, always calculating. Within minutes of meeting Eleanor, she had already asked about Franklin's latest business ventures, mentioned 2 deals she was closing that month, and suggested that a partnership between the families could benefit everyone involved. She called it friendship. She meant business. The third was Simone Carter. Simone was loud and warm on the surface, dropping famous names into every sentence like decorations on a cake. While walking through the west hallway of the estate, Simone glanced at the woman quietly mopping near the window and said, without lowering her voice, "You really should upgrade your staff, Eleanor. Some people just don't fit the image, you know." She laughed like it was nothing. Eleanor did not laugh. She looked at the woman mopping the floor. The woman did not look up, but they both knew she had heard every word. Her name was Nia. The 4th woman was Whitney Blackburn. Old money, old rules. She arrived with a gift for Eleanor, which turned out to be a book on proper etiquette. She spent the entire visit correcting the way Eleanor sat, the way she laughed, the way she held her fork. By the end of the afternoon, Eleanor felt like she was being graded on a test she never signed up for. The 5th and final woman was Georgia Lane. Georgia was pure energy, constant laughter, constant performance. She filmed everything, the garden, the dinner table, Eleanor mid-sentence without asking. At one point, she went live on social media from the front steps of the estate, talking about her wonderful time with a dear friend, a name she got slightly wrong. By the end of the 3rd day, Franklin asked Eleanor what she thought of the women he had chosen. Eleanor closed her book, looked at her father, and said, "They were all very impressive, Dad." Franklin nodded, satisfied. Eleanor did not say the rest of what she was thinking. Not yet. It happened in the quiet moments in between, the ones nobody plans but everybody remembers. Alina had slipped away from the main rooms, looking for air, looking for something she couldn't quite name. She wandered down the west hallway and found herself at the top of the back staircase. That's where she saw Nia. Nia was mopping the marble floor the way she did every single afternoon. She was humming something soft under her breath, an old tune Alina couldn't place but somehow recognized deep in her chest. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't performing. She was simply present, moving through her work with a quiet grace that filled the whole hallway without making a sound. Alina sat down on the top step and just watched. Nia looked up and smiled, not the practiced smile of the 5 women who had passed through this house, but a real simple smile, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. "You look tired, Miss Alina," Nia said. "I am," Alina answered. And it was the most honest thing she had said all week. That's how it started. Alina asked Nia how long she had worked at the estate. 9 years, Nia told her. Through the renovations, the quiet years, the loud years. She had been there when Alina's mother was still alive. Alina's chest tightened. She asked what her mother was like around the house when nobody important was watching, and Nia told her. She told her about the notes Alina's mother used to leave for the staff every Friday, thanking them by name. About the times she brought soup down to the kitchen herself when someone was sick. About the afternoon she spent helping Nia rearrange the pantry shelves because Nia had mentioned just once that they were hard to reach. Small things, true things. Things Franklin had never told Alina, not because he was hiding them, but because grief has a way of locking certain memories behind doors we're too afraid to open. Alina's eyes filled with tears. She didn't hide them. Nia didn't make a fuss over them either. She simply nodded the way people do when they understand that some feelings just need space to exist. After that day, Alina found herself drawn to that hallway again and again. No big reason. No plan. She'd bring a book and sit on the stairs while Nia worked. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. Nia never asked for anything, she never tried to impress anyone. And somewhere in those small, unscripted afternoons, Alina found what she had been missing all along, not connections, not status. Just someone who saw her as a person, not a position. Franklin noticed. He always noticed everything. He saw Alina laughing on the back stairs. He saw the tray of tea Nia quietly left outside her door. He saw his daughter's shoulders relax in that hallway in a way they never did in the formal rooms of the house. One evening, without quite meaning to, he stopped at the end of the hallway and listened. Nia was telling Alina a story about something funny that happened in the garden years ago. Alina was laughing, really laughing, the kind of laugh Franklin hadn't heard from her in years. Franklin stood in the shadows and felt something shift in his chest, something he had kept very still for a very long time. The next morning, he called Alina into his office. He told her firmly that the 5 women were her future, that Nia worked for this family. That there was a difference, and that difference mattered. Alina looked at her father with her mother's eyes and said simply, "I know, Dad." Then she stood up and left. She hadn't agreed with him. She had just ended the conversation. But Franklin couldn't close what had already opened inside him. He found himself walking that hallway more often. He told himself it was to check the floors. He told himself many things. One afternoon, Nia was polishing an old picture frame near the hallway window, a painting of the estate gardens from decades ago. Franklin stopped and said quietly, "My wife chose that painting." Without turning around, Nia said, "I know, she told me it reminded her of her grandmother's garden." Franklin went still. In all his years of marriage, he had never known that. He asked Nia to tell him more. Franklin arranged a formal dinner. All 5 women returned, dressed beautifully, performing gracefully. The table was set with the finest china, candles, crystal glasses. The kind of evening Franklin once believed represented his world at its best, but something in him had changed and he couldn't quite name it yet. He watched Isabella snap her fingers at a server without looking up. He watched Monique steer every conversation back to numbers and deals. He watched Simone make a joke about the household staff that drew polite laughter from the table. He watched Georgia film her plate before eating, then push it aside for the camera. And he thought about Nia, 9 years in that house. Someone who remembered things about his wife that he himself had forgotten. Someone who never asked for more than she was given. Then Alina set down her glass. The table went quiet. She spoke calmly, without anger but without apology either. "Real people," she said, "don't make others feel invisible. And the most important thing I learned this week is that someone's worth isn't measured by what they own. It's measured by what they give when nobody's watching." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Alina excused herself, and for the first time in his life, Franklin didn't ask her to stay. Word spread fast, the way it always does among wealthy families. Franklin's brother arrived 2 days later with 2 cousins and an aunt who suddenly had a lot of opinions about the family name. They sat in the formal living room and said what people like them always say when something surprises them. They called it foolish. They called it embarrassing. They talked about reputation and appearances. Franklin let them finish. Then he said the one thing that ended the conversation completely. She has worked in this house for 9 years. She knew my wife better than most of you did. She has given this family more without ever being asked than any of you ever have on purpose, and not one of you has ever asked her name. He paused. Her name is Nia. I think you should all go home now. Nobody said another word. They left. And the house was quiet again, the way it always is after something important happens. Alina was standing in the doorway. She had heard every word. She looked at her father, this man she had known her whole life, this man who was always so certain about everything. And for the first time, she saw something new in him, something that looked just slightly like the man her mother had once loved. She didn't say anything, she just nodded once. Franklin nodded back. Franklin didn't rush. That surprised everyone who knew him because rushing was what Franklin did best, but this time he was patient. He started small. He stopped walking past Nia in the hallway. He started stopping, asking real questions, listening to real answers. He quietly improved staff conditions across the estate without ever announcing it. Nia noticed. Nia always noticed everything, but she said nothing. Until one evening, Franklin finally said what he'd been carrying for months. He found her in the garden near the old wooden bench, pulling on her coat at the end of her shift. He told her plainly, without performance, that he hadn't felt like himself in almost 10 years, and that somehow, without meaning to, she had given something back to him. Nia looked at him for a long moment, then she said no. She said it gently but clearly. She told him she would not be the cure for his loneliness, that she was not a solution to an empty house. That if what he felt was real, it would still be real in 6 months, and he would need to prove that with time, not words. Franklin looked at her, and for the first time in his adult life, someone had told him no, and he felt nothing but respect. So he waited. He showed up not with grand gestures but with consistency, with honesty, with the quiet, unglamorous work of becoming someone worthy of trust from a woman who had already seen the worst of the world and still chose to remain gentle in it. 6 months later, he asked again. This time, Nia said yes. The wedding was small. Franklin had offered something grand, and Nia had smiled and said she'd rather have something honest. So it happened in the estate garden in the late afternoon light, surrounded by a handful of people who actually mattered. Alina stood beside Nia as she walked through the garden. She wasn't wearing a gown covered in gold. She wore something simple, elegant, entirely her own. And she was the most beautiful person there, not because of what she wore, but because of how she carried herself, like a woman with nothing to prove and no one left to impress. The 5 women heard about it eventually, the way people always hear about things they weren't invited to. Isabella made a comment at a party. Monique called it strange. Simone posted something vague online. Whitney was quietly appalled. Georgia filmed a reaction video. None of it mattered. Because in that garden, Franklin Hayes, a man who had spent decades measuring the worth of everything around him, stood next to a woman who had never measured her own worth at all. And for the first time, he understood what it actually meant to be rich. Alina stood at the edge of the garden, watching her father and Nia walk together under the string lights. Something settled in her chest, something that had been restless for a very long time. She thought about the 5 women who had passed through the estate. She didn't dislike them. She understood them in a way. They had been taught, like so many people are, that worth is something you display, that the right life looks a certain way, sounds a certain way, costs a certain amount. Nobody had ever told them that the most valuable thing in any room is usually the thing nobody is showing off. Nia had never tried to be anything, and somehow that made her everything. And Franklin, who had spent his whole life building, measuring, and controlling, had finally learned the one lesson his money could never teach him, that the most important people in your life don't arrive trying to impress you. They arrive quietly, doing the work, asking for nothing, and leaving something behind in every room they enter. Some people are diamonds, bright and hard and loud, and some people are like light itself, steady, warm, present in every corner, never demanding to be noticed. Nia was light. And it just took 2 people, a daughter and her father, to finally look up from everything that glitters and see her. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that kindness is still the most powerful thing in any room, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The world already has enough stories about people who fought their way to the top. This one is for the people who stayed good on the way there. Follow this channel for more stories that make you feel something real. We'll see you in the next one.